You stood on stage as a god of raw emotion, trembling with truth while the world cheered. Behind the curtain, you were hollowed out by a silence no script could fill. The camera loved your eyes, their storm, their ache, but no one saw the nights you stared at ceilings, counting breaths instead of dreams. You refused the Oscars, turned down legends, walked away from fortunes, all while the studio system called you ungrateful. Why would a man who redefined acting spend decades punishing himself for it? Stay with me, because the real tragedy wasn't fame. It was what fame demanded you erase to keep it. Marlon Brando didn't become a legend because he was born great. He became one because he fought a war no one else could see. In the late 1940s, New York's actor studio was a cathedral of method, and he was its most dangerous priest. He didn't just play characters. He let them crawl inside him, live in his bones, steal his sleep. When he stepped onto the set of A Streetcar Named Desire, he didn't rehearse. He became Stanley Kowalski. The sweat, the rage, the animal hunger in his voice. The audience didn't watch a performance. They witnessed a man unraveling in real time, and they loved him for it. But what they didn't know, what no review mentioned, was that after every take, he'd lock himself in his trailer and sob until his ribs ached. He told a friend once, "I don't act, I drown." The world called him a genius. The studio called him difficult. His agent called him suicidal. He had been raised in a house where love was conditional, where his mother's affection flickered like a dying bulb. Dorothy Brando was a gifted actress in her own right, charismatic, magnetic, the kind of woman who could command a room with a sigh. But alcohol had stolen her clarity, her stability, and eventually her ability to mother. Young Marlon would watch her collapse into fits of weeping, then lash out with cruel words that cut deeper than any slap. His father, Marlon Brando Sr., a distant, rigid man of Midwestern propriety, offered little refuge. He saw emotion as weakness, sensitivity as flaw. By the age of 8, Marlon had learned to disappear not physically, but emotionally. He mimicked accents, copied gestures, adopted personas like armor. It was survival. But it was also the seed of his gift. At Shattuck Military Academy, he was expelled for insubordination, not because he was violent, but because he refused to submit. "I can't pretend to respect something that doesn't respect me," he later wrote. That line would echo through his entire career. He wasn't rebellious for show. He was allergic to hypocrisy. And Hollywood, as he would soon learn, ran on nothing else. By the time he arrived in New York in 1943, broken sleeping on friends' couches, he carried with him a suitcase full of silence and a voice that could crack concrete. He studied under Stella Adler, who taught him that acting wasn't about reliving your pain, it was about transforming it into something universal. But Brando, ever the literalist, couldn't separate himself from the wound. When he played a boxer in On the Waterfront, he didn't just simulate exhaustion, he starved himself for weeks to feel the hollow ache of defeat in his gut. He sparred with real fighters until his knuckles split open. He wanted truth, even if it cost him his body, and the world rewarded him for it, then punished him for refusing to repeat it. The studio executives at Warner Brothers and MGM saw his raw power and thought, "Perfect, we'll package this." They offered him leading man roles, romantic dramas, war epics, anything that kept him shirtless, brooding, and marketable. But Brando hated labels. He turned down East of Eden, believing James Dean was the right choice. He walked away from Lawrence of Arabia because he refused to be part of a colonial fantasy. He once said, "I'm not a movie star. I'm a worker who happens to be on screen." That humility drove the industry mad. How dare he reject the throne they'd built for him? What they never understood was that every time he performed, he felt like a fraud. Not because he lacked talent, but because the performance required him to be seen. And being seen meant being vulnerable. And vulnerability, in his childhood, had always been punished. So he created distance. He mumbled lines on purpose, showed up late, demanded absurd writers. He wasn't being petty, he was building walls. If they thought he was difficult, they'd stop asking him to be something he wasn't. He was 24 when Streetcar exploded. By 26, he was Hollywood's most expensive star and its most reluctant prisoner. The studio wanted more Brando, the brooding, shirtless, primal force. But what they got was a man who hated being reduced to a type. He turned down The Godfather 3 times. He thought the script was a cartoon. He didn't want to play a mob boss. He wanted to play a man who had lost everything and still couldn't scream. When he finally accepted the role, he did it under protest, refusing to memorize lines, stuffing his cheeks with cotton to mimic the jawline of a real-life mobster he'd studied in prison visits. He showed up to the premiere in a wheelchair, claiming he'd broken his back. He hadn't. He just didn't want to be there. What the public never saw was the quiet, trembling man who sat alone in his Malibu home, watching his own films on a grainy TV, whispering, "That's not me." His retreat wasn't arrogance, it was preservation. By the 1960s, he'd grown disillusioned with an industry that commodified Black and Indigenous suffering while ignoring real injustice. He traveled to Mississippi during the Freedom Rides. He met with Malcolm X. He funded bail for civil rights activists. None of it made headlines. None of it was for show. He believed art without action was vanity, but even his activism came at a cost. In 1973, after Sachin Littlefeather's Oscar appearance, he was blacklisted by the Academy for decades. Colleagues distanced themselves. Projects dried up. Yet he didn't care. "Let them boycott me," he reportedly told a confidant. "I'd rather be forgotten than be their puppet." Years later, the same man who had once set the screen on fire would sit in a rented bungalow in the Mojave Desert, reading poetry to himself, growing his own vegetables, refusing interviews. He had money millions, but he gave most of it away to native rights groups, to orphanages in India, to friends who asked for help, quietly, without fanfare. He didn't want his name on buildings. He didn't want museums. He wanted to be forgotten. And yet, the world kept calling. In 1972, he was offered $3.7 million to appear in The Godfather Part 2. He took it, then gave half to a Native American legal fund. He filmed his scenes in 3 days, barely speaking to the crew. He didn't want to be remembered as Michael Corleone. He wanted to be remembered as the man who tried to leave. But leaving wasn't that simple. His son Christian was just 15 when he shot and killed Doug Drolet, a friend of his, in a drunken, chaotic confrontation in 1990. The incident was splashed across every tabloid. The world saw a tragic celebrity family unraveling. What they didn't see was the father who had spent decades trying to teach his children how to survive in a world that consumed them only to fail. Marlon had been silent on his own pain. Now he was silent on his son's. He never spoke publicly about the trial, never gave a statement. He simply vanished from public view. Some say he never recovered. Others say he finally understood. He had spent his life screaming into a void, hoping someone would hear him. But the void only echoed back the image they wanted. The rebel, the icon, the genius. He had no voice left. By the 1990s, he was living in a modest home in Los Angeles, surrounded by books, records, and the quiet hum of a refrigerator. He rarely left. He refused to watch television. He stopped answering phones. He told his assistant, "If they want to know who I am, they can read the films. I've said everything I have to say." But the films didn't tell the whole story. They didn't tell of the nights he sat on the floor of his bathroom, rocking back and forth, whispering apologies to his mother who had died decades earlier, still angry at him for not being the son she imagined. They didn't tell of the time he drove for hours just to sit outside the house where his sister, Jocelyn, had lived, watching the windows, too afraid to knock. She had struggled with mental illness for years, and Marlon, despite his power, couldn't fix it. He carried that helplessness like a stone in his chest. He didn't just lose people, he failed them in silence. And that silence grew louder with every passing year. He tried to rebuild. He directed a rarely seen documentary on Native American rights in the 1970s, titled Liberation. He funded a school for Hopi children in Arizona, insisting the curriculum honor their language and history. He wrote letters to senators, begging them to honor broken treaties. He spoke at rallies, his voice hoarse, his posture weary, but his conviction unshaken. He didn't do it for glory. He did it because he believed, deep down, that if he could help even one child escape the cycle of erasure, he'd known being seen only for what others wanted him to be. Then maybe he could forgive himself. But forgiveness never came. Not from the world, not from his family, not even from himself. In his final years, he was frail, overweight, his once piercing eyes dulled by years of painkillers and quiet despair. Diabetes ravaged his body. He moved slowly, spoke rarely, yet he found solace in simple things. Feeding stray cats, listening to jazz on vinyl, watching the ocean from his porch. He lived with his longtime companion, Movita Castaneda, who had known him since the 1940s. She was the only person who never asked him to be anything other than who he was. No scripts, no interviews, no performances, just silence and coffee, and the occasional laugh, sudden and bright, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. When he died in 2004, the world mourned. Headlines called him a titan. Critics called him the greatest actor of his generation. The Oscars held a tribute. His name was etched into history. But in his home, no one played music. No one cried out loud. They just sat and remembered. The truth no one talks about, he never wanted to be remembered. He just wanted to be allowed to rest. We think of legends as men who conquered their time, but Marlon Brando was the rare kind who outlasted his own legend. He didn't die a hero. He died a survivor of a system that turned his trauma into box office gold, of a culture that demanded his pain but refused his peace, of a family fractured by fame, addiction, and unspoken grief. He didn't need another Oscar. He didn't need another role. He needed someone to say, "You were enough, just as you were." And no one ever did, not even him. The myth of Marlon Brando was that he was untouchable. The truth, he was terrified. He feared that if he ever stopped performing even for a second, he would disappear. And so he kept acting, even when there was no audience, even when there was no script, even when there was no point. He was the last man on earth who believed his own silence was a performance. And that, more than any role, any award, any scandal, was the greatest tragedy of all. Because the world didn't lose a genius when he died. It lost a boy who never stopped begging to be seen. And no one ever looked closely enough to notice he was already gone. If you've ever felt like your worth was tied to what you produced, what you achieved, what you appeared to be, then you knew Marlon Brando better than you think. He didn't just play characters. He played the version of himself the world demanded. And in doing so, he buried the only one who ever really mattered. If stories like this remind you that the most powerful people are often the most broken, subscribe. Because the next legend you admire, they might be crying too.